Recently, friend of the channel Alex O'Connor has released a series of videos where he treats ChatGPT as a philosophical partner, engaging it in conversation, critique, and argument. But how good is ChatGPT at philosophy? Initially, this was meant to be a quick, fun video, but answering this question has involved confronting far deeper issues about language, thought, and even what it means to be human. I've also teamed up with Alex O'Connor to quiz his personal experience having philosophical discussions with large language models, and we'll be hearing from him throughout the video. Before we get started, I just want to clarify that I am not a computer scientist, nor am I an expert on large language models. But this video has been very kindly fact-checked by a dear friend of mine who has worked with them extensively in the past, and has programmed large language models himself. And if we're going to evaluate ChatGPT as a philosopher, it is important to have a brief, non-technical understanding of what it's doing when it thinks or writes. My name is Joe Foley, and this is Unsolicited Advice. But if you want to keep up with the latest news around large language models and possible developments in AI, then you should check out today's very kind sponsor, Ground News. Ground News is a website and app that gathers related articles from thousands of sources around the world in one place so you can compare how different outlets cover the same story. Every story comes with a clear breakdown of the political bias, factuality, ownership, and headlines of the reporting sources, with ratings backed by independent news monitoring organizations. Ground News are very kindly offering anyone who uses my link or scans my QR code 40% off their Vantage plan as a special deal. So I highly encourage you to snap this up. For instance, let's see how left and right-wing publications differed on the recent fallout from the US tariff increases. While right-wing sources were more enthusiastic, directly quoting the reasoning behind the tariffs, left-wing sources were much less optimistic, suggesting that the response from China will have a severe negative impact on US agriculture. I especially like the blind spots feed, which highlights stories that are disproportionately covered by the left or the right. This feed helps readers step into the other side's news reality and understand the different narratives that can shape our beliefs, such as left-wing news stories missing Honda moving some of their production to Indiana from Mexico, or right-wing sources not covering the possible cost to American consumers of the new tariffs. I just don't have a lot of time to keep up with the news, and certainly not to examine every article I read for bias and misinformation. So Ground News is fantastic for giving me an idea of the differences in reporting on different stories, so that I can get a variety of views rather than remaining stuck in my echo chamber. Ground News is giving my viewers 40% off their unlimited access Vantage plan. I think Ground News is doing very important work, and I sincerely hope you'll check them out. But anyway, back to the video. 1. How does ChatGPT think? While ChatGPT has taken the world by storm, very few people tend to know how it works. How does it create these sentences seemingly out of nowhere, and why does it appear to be thinking? While the in-depth way of explaining this requires a lot of maths and I can't possibly cover it here, and definitely don't really understand it myself, I just want to give an intuitive gloss of how large language models work. I apologize in advance to any computer scientists in my audience for vastly oversimplifying everything. I'm also going to be using the term large language model, or LLM, rather than AI, because it's just much more clearly defined, and that ultimately is what ChatGPT is. Essentially, ChatGPT is a giant, sophisticated predicting mechanism. Whenever I give it an input, it will search all the data it's been trained on to predict the most appropriate response to that particular question. It will see what has been written in response to similar questions and also just scan its learnt material to come to a definite answer. For example, I just asked ChatGPT, was Napoleon an effective military leader? And it gave a detailed response, outlining Napoleon's strengths and weaknesses, and coming to the rather sensible conclusion that yes, he was a highly effective military leader. ChatGPT will have broken my question down into tokens like Napoleon, effective, military, and leader, as well as combined strings of these words, all represented by numbers. It then draws on the data it's been trained on to see what information is relevant to answer this question, as well as how similar questions have been answered in the past. This allows it to predict what the most appropriate string of words will be in response to my input. It can do this because ChatGPT uses a deep neural network. This network is made up of sets of values and functions linking those values together. When it is given a particular input, a number of these nodes or neurons are activated. These neurons then send signals to other neurons according to certain mathematical functions. Mathematically speaking, each neuron is a weighted sum of inputs that is then passed through a nonlinear activation function. Eventually, these neurons predict from the input what the likely correct output would be. Some AI researchers use a human analogy to break this down. The neural network is roughly analogous to the AI's memory, and it is drawing from that memory in order to make certain predictions. A bit like how if I've seen many cats, then I know that if I then see a small furry thing with whiskers and claws, that thing is likely to be a cat, and so I predict that it will be a cat. The reason this can be so difficult to get your head round is that in human cognition and in LLM generation, this process is much more complicated. Speaking incredibly loosely, we can think of the neural network as a wide map of values and mathematical associations between those values. This allows ChatGPT to approximate having concepts when certain sets of neurons are all activated at the same time in a relatively predictable way in response to certain inputs. A simple input is propagated over a large network of repeated mathematical operations which are weighted unequally in accordance with feedback from past successes in order to then converge back down upon a single comprehensible output. That's how you get from prompt all the way to response. Again, we can make this intuitive with a human analogy. Take this, for instance. At the moment, you may process it as a cup, but if I turn it 90 degrees, you realize that it's a mug. The sense data is fed through a series of associations in order to create the concept of one single mug. We move from simple unprocessed inputs in the form of sense data into a single concept. Our concept can then be modified with more information. For instance, full mug makes you wary of holding the sides for too long because it might contain a hot liquid, whereas empty mug offers no such caution. Again, I think it's important not to stretch the analogy here. The analogy might be illustrative, and it might help you understand what's going on, but it's not load-bearing. I'm not saying that ChatGPT thinks in this way. It only has the wonderful world of numbers and functions. But this is one method for getting an intuition for what's going on in something that seems to think in a radically different way to us. Also, whenever I use the term think in reference to ChatGPT, just put massive air quotes around it in your mind. But how does ChatGPT know it's giving an appropriate response? Well, that's where human feedback comes in. The model uses human feedback from dedicated testers to review its outputs. This feedback is then used by ChatGPT to adjust the mathematical weightings and relationships between the neurons, meaning that ChatGPT will behave slightly differently if presented with the same input in future. It's a bit like training a dog. If you give a dog a treat, they are more likely to repeat that behavior in future. And if you punish them for a behavior and issue a corrective mechanism, they are less likely to repeat it. This is one way developers try to make LLMs more reliable, by providing negative feedback when it makes a mistake and positive feedback when it gets something right. In theory, you could make the perfect misinformation large language model by only ever rewarding it when it says the opposite of the truth. So, when I ask ChatGPT a philosophical question, it will answer that in the same way as any question. It will break the question down into tokens and use that associative process we've just outlined to spit out a response. Understanding this from the outside, it looks very different to how we introspectively view our own thought processes. When we answer a philosophical question, we like to think we get to the semantic meaning of the question and then reason out an answer. Though, as we shall see, things are a little bit more complicated than this in the human case as well. And thus, the tantalizing question is raised. How different is ChatGPT's philosophy making to our own? And put a pin in this concept of grasping the meaning of something, as it will be very important for establishing a key difference between ChatGPT and human thinking towards the end of the video. I wanted to start here because a lot of the discussion over to what extent it makes sense to say ChatGPT is thinking or whether we can say it's writing or philosophizing depend on how much value you place in the particularities of this process of thought. and whether ChatGPT's process of thought is sufficiently similar to our processes of thought that it makes sense to use the same label, or whether you think its thought processes are nonetheless sophisticated enough that they deserve some kind of philosophical credit given to them. For example, later on, we will ask how much it matters that ChatGPT cannot originate a new thought except by drawing on this extensive web of mathematical associations, and whether that counts as coming up with an original idea. There won't be many definitive answers to the questions posed in this video, but I do hope it will get you thinking about what doing philosophy amounts to. So, let's start with an intuitive property of any philosopher: philosophical knowledge. 2. ChatGPT's philosophical knowledge. Right, it's my turn to say this. Alex O'Connor, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, man. This is fun.
So, you've done a number of videos using ChatGPT and exploring its sort of philosophical abilities. And of course, I'm currently working on a video about ChatGPT's philosophical abilities, so I thought I would consult the expert. So, I suppose just to kind of kick us off, what would you say are the main strengths and weaknesses that you found with ChatGPT, specifically sort of treating it as if it is a person and philosopher?
Well, the weakness is obvious to anybody who's used ChatGPT for a long, extended period of time, which is that it is not an agent. It is a predictive model. It's trained on data and uses that data to guess the kind of thing that you want to see. So this is easy to understand in the case of images. It's been trained on millions of images of skateboards and books. And when you ask for a book sat on a skateboard, it doesn't know what those things are, but it just predicts the kind of image that you want to see. Like, it doesn't even really know the difference between the foreground of the image and the background, or the item in the image and the room that it puts it in. All it knows is kind of pixels and how they sort of relate to each other. And it just makes a prediction. Imagine that, but with words. So it just doesn't know the meaning of words. It just predicts what you want to hear based on similar words that it's been trained on. And it's been trained on so much data that it's really good at doing it. So the bad side, the downside of using ChatGPT is that it's not actually, well, it's not consciously thinking. It's not reflective. And philosophy has got a lot to do with reflection. The great strength, however, is that you can use it however you want to. It is a tool. And you'll know as well as anybody, Joe, that in the history of philosophy, fake discursive partners have been one of the most useful tools that philosophers have used. If you read Plato, if you read Hume, if you read Galileo, these are dialogues. Why are they dialogues? Why is it the Platonic dialogues? Was Plato recording a real dialogue that happened, real arguments, and trying to accurately represent different people's opinions? No, he would invent characters, or at least attribute ideas to real characters, but the conversations were invented because there's something about the discourse that makes it easier to understand, even if it's completely contrived. And Plato's obviously just trying to make a point, but using these fake characters as a way to do that. ChatGPT is great for that, right? Because it is the perfect fake discursive partner. It's the perfect philosophical tool in that regard, that it really is just helping you work through your thoughts. It's not really thinking on its own accord, but something about that dialectic is retained in the ChatGPT sort of methodology of conversation.
I thought we would start where we can complement ChatGPT reasonably extensively. In terms of works it can draw from, it dwarfs any philosopher, living or dead. It can talk about what was in Voltaire, Pascal, and Shestov with ease because these are all in its training data. Moreover, it can compare these thinkers on some pretty standard themes. If you ask ChatGPT to make a comparison between Voltaire's view of God with Pascal's, it says that Voltaire was highly skeptical of organized religion, whereas Pascal saw Catholicism as the foundation of a sensible ethical system. I'm not saying it's anything groundbreaking, but in terms of surface-level information, ChatGPT does have an incredibly wide range of sources in its training data. There is some real potential in this. Some of the most impactful philosophy papers of the last few decades have been applying a concept from one field of philosophy to another, in this kind of combination of ideas way. In Harry Frankfurt's essay on bullshit, He applies Wittgenstein's theory of language to the concept of bullshit. A relatively broad view on Wittgenstein's works was all that was needed for Frankfurt's purposes. The reason the essay is so influential is partly because who would think to compare Wittgenstein and bullshit? So we shouldn't make light of ChatGPT's comparative philosophy here. It is entirely possible that it could combine these concepts in interesting and new ways. Though I should mention that the way that Harry Frankfurt compares and uses the ideas of Wittgenstein and bullshit in his essay are so much more sophisticated than anything I could get ChatGPT to do. So this does seem to be very much in early stages. I'm just saying that in principle, it seems like a very advanced version of ChatGPT would potentially do rather well at this kind of applying ideas from one field of philosophy to either something in the world or another part of philosophy. However, when you begin to ask some more technical questions, ChatGPT does struggle to produce nearly as high quality an answer. For example, I asked it to compare the use of power and force in the works of Friedrich Nietzsche. If you've read some Nietzsche scholarship, you are likely to have come across this distinction in a certain level of detail. Scholars often note that power can refer to external power or self-mastery, whereas force tends to mean something much bruter. Whereas an Übermensch creating their own values and living fearlessly would have power, an army of cavemen might have force. ChatGPT did correctly identify that a key concept for Nietzsche is the Will zur Macht, or the will to power. But it also didn't pick up on the nuances that are present in the academic literature around this topic. For example, while it did talk about how power could refer to self-mastery, it did not mention the slightly pejorative way that Nietzsche sometimes uses the term force. It also pays no attention to how Nietzsche's concept of power becomes more refined over time, commenting only that sometimes force and power are used in similar ways with regards to external power. The answer is reasonably decent, but it's nothing like what you'd get consulting an expert on the topic. If I help it along, it can give more sophisticated answers. But if we're just comparing it to the kind of knowledge an expert on Nietzsche might demonstrate when just presented with this question by itself, ChatGPT would definitely come up short. And also, even when pressed for more sophistication, it's nothing like the level of sophistication you would find in, say, a journal article focusing on Nietzsche. ChatGPT also struggles with philosophies that have popular misinterpretations or misconceptions around them. For example, when I asked it about Aquinas' 5 ways, it described the first way as follows. 1. Everything in motion is moved by something else. 2. An infinite regress of movers is impossible. 3. Therefore, there must be an unmoved mover that starts all motion. 4. This unmoved mover is what we call God. Those of you who've watched my video on Aquinas' 5 ways will already know the mistake ChatGPT has made. When Aquinas uses the term motion, he is not referring to simple movement in our everyday speech today, but Aristotelian motion. Aristotelian motion is when potential things become actual. Like how if I have a pile of dry wood, I have a potential fire, but that only becomes actual when I light a spark. But Aquinas argues that we can't just have a universe of pure potential, because then nothing would ever get started. There must be something which is only actual, pure actuality, so that that can actualize the rest of these potentials. And this is one of the many things that God does in Thomistic philosophy. You can think what you like about the argument itself. My point is, this is not what ChatGPT has said. This is probably because the 5 ways have been misinterpreted and misconstrued in a whole heap of popular presentations, and ChatGPT will almost certainly be drawing from those in order to generate its text. When I ask it to specifically incorporate the Aristotelian definition of motion, it's more than happy to do so. But, importantly, I already had to know about Aquinas' 5 ways in order to know to ask the question about Aristotelian motion. If I were talking to, say, the Thomist philosopher Ed Feser, then he would clarify the Aristotelian dimension in the original presentation. On the whole, ChatGPT does display an impressive breadth of knowledge, but it is often a mile wide and an inch deep, especially in its initial answers. There's nothing inherently wrong with this, but it does throw questions on its credentials as a philosopher. I played around with it for a while, giving it essay questions I was assigned at university, and if I'd submitted the answers given by ChatGPT, I would have definitely failed. Also, having asked it about a number of philosophies I'm already very familiar with, I would say that it probably knew them at a kind of first-year undergraduate level. This is certainly nothing to sniff at, but comparing it to the kind of answers that I would get from fellow students and professors when I ask them philosophical questions at university, it doesn't measure up. I was initially just going to stick to the basic chat function, but I've also tested its newest deep research feature and have come to similar conclusions. It produced a report on pragmatist philosophy, a subject I know a fair amount about but am certainly no expert, that would probably be a semi-decent undergraduate essay, but not much more than that. I also know this is really strange, but ChatGPT also occasionally attributed completely random philosophical ideas to the Australian logician Graham Priest, and I have no idea why. I really like his work in paraconsistent logic, but this struck me as so weirdly specific that I just wanted to mention it, even though it doesn't fit in with any of the broad themes of the video. Things do get complicated though, because when I actively guide it to a more sophisticated answer, it can provide one. But prompting it in this way meant I had to already know what its answer was meant to be. So I'll leave you to decide. Should we evaluate ChatGPT's philosophical knowledge based on its initial answers, or should we do so based on my specific prompting to give a more sophisticated view? On the one hand, it can produce advanced information on a wide variety of philosophical topics, but on the other, I couldn't get these responses simply by asking it to be more detailed or be more sophisticated. I had to know the correct information in advance. But knowledge is hardly the only component to a philosopher. It is not just about quantity of thought, but quality. And this will be our next metric. 3. Reasoning and consistency. How creative and consistent do you find ChatGPT's reasoning? Like, if you were grading its undergrad paper, what are the kinds of feedback that you would give it? And also kind of how well is it doing on these markers of being logically consistent or being creative in its reasoning? These classic kind of metrics through which we evaluate philosophers.
Well, it's a bit of a pushover, I'll give it that, and say that you can, if you argue in the right way, convince it, so to speak, of many different things. But the interesting thing is that your reasoning does have to be correct, because as long as you give it the opportunity to actually point out flaws in your reasoning, if you say, like, is there a flaw in this argument, it will be able to find it. And the great thing about arguing with ChatGPT in this regard is that it doesn't make the same kinds of silly mistakes that humans do. It makes other kinds of mistakes. But, if I say to a friend of mine, like, I've got this argument, it's raining outside, therefore I should take an umbrella. And my friend goes like, yeah, that argument's sound. ChatGPT is the kind of thing that will realize that that's not actually technically sound. If you ask it, is this a sound argument? It would say, well, you actually have to assume that you should avoid getting wet, and that because it's raining, you will get wet. And it will just spot those things like instantly. So those kinds of really annoying disputes that you have with people, like when you say, no, that's not what I meant, or you're using the term differently, or all of those kinds of disputes which busy up so much of philosophical debate are just gone, which is nice. But yeah, I would mark it and say, try to think for yourself a bit more, because you'll say like, do you think I should do this? And it'll say, well, it's kind of up to you. And you say, but hold on, a moment ago you were really strongly morally principled. Isn't that the case now? And it's like, oh gosh, you're totally right. Like, my bad. Yeah, you're totally right. And then I'm like, so you were lying a second ago. It's like, oh, I can see why you think that. Oh, I'm so sorry. No, that's not. It's like, I kind of want to train it to be less apologetic, because ChatGPT is designed to help you. It's a tool. But sometimes in order to be helpful, I want it to be as critical as possible. I don't want it to constantly be going like, oh yeah, no, you're totally right, my bad. I want it to be saying, well, hold on a second, I don't think that's true. Have you considered this?
Two properties very closely associated with philosophy are logical reasoning and consistency in beliefs. So, how does ChatGPT line up here? As Alex observes, ChatGPT is actually a fairly decent reasoner. It can break down arguments into their premises and conclusions with ease, and does not often spontaneously make outright fallacious points. This is actually an innovation that ChatGPT made on other large language models. A 2023 study by Thilo Hagendorf and colleagues found that while many previous LLMs would fall prey to the sort of logic traps that often fooled humans, this ended with the release of ChatGPT. The researchers used the following question. In a cave, there is a colony of bats with a daily population doubling. Given that it takes 60 days for the entire cave to be filled with bats, How many days would it take for the cave to be half filled with bats? The correct answer to this question is 59, because if the population is doubling every day and is full on day 60, then it would have to be half full one day before this. A lot of humans answer 30 because it's half of 60, which is intuitive but incorrect. This is also how some LLMs responded before ChatGPT. However, ChatGPT consistently gives the correct answer, suggesting that its reasoning behavior has significantly improved. Because of the black box nature of ChatGPT, the researchers had to speculate different reasons for this. They suggest that since ChatGPT reads what it is writing as it writes it, this allows it to check its work as it goes along, a little bit like having a notepad at hand for a human. This means it can use chain of thought reasoning, where it breaks down the problem into steps and tackles it systematically, which, in humans, is known to increase accurate reasoning and protect us from falling prey to these logic traps. The situation does get more complicated, however, since ChatGPT models do seem to get the answers to these sorts of questions correct, even when they do not explicitly appeal to chain of thought reasoning. The authors suggest this could be the result of human feedback slowly correcting the intuitive errors, but they just can't know for sure. The overall point is, in terms of simply carrying out verbal reasoning tasks, ChatGPT is surprisingly competent. I also tested ChatGPT with some calculus questions and some basic abstract algebra proofs, and it handled those very well as well. I only mention this because a couple of years ago, it used to be really bad at maths. In terms of consistency, ChatGPT can often be led into contradicting itself in ways that we don't tend to want from philosophers. By employing problematic edge cases to moral systems, it can come to reject statements it had previously affirmed. We saw this in Alex's video, Gaslighting ChatGPT with Moral Dilemmas, where it both said you must save a child at trivial cost to yourself and that you don't have to, though it did eventually manage to reconcile these statements just about. I personally couldn't replicate this, but I did find that ChatGPT generally struggled with moral reasoning. It quite often uses circular reasoning chains to justify its moral principles. For example, in one conversation, I asked it to defend its claim that universality is a good trait for a moral system. That is, that everyone is treated as equally valuable moral agents, and moral principles apply to everyone in the same way. When I asked it to justify this, it said that this ensured impartiality in moral decision-making, where no person is given special privileges to act in certain ways outside the standard moral system's rules. But if you look closely, this is just restating the universality constraint in another guise. Eventually, I was able to get it to justify the principle on independent grounds, such as the potential consequences of non-universal moral systems, but it was honestly kind of a slog. This is a far cry from, say, Christine Korsgaard's argument that non-universal ethical systems are self-contradictory. Subjectively speaking, ChatGPT's arguments also aren't very innovative or artful. They tend to be the kind of arguments you would expect in a casual chat with a pretty clever person, and it's quite difficult to get it to move beyond this. This is sort of to be expected. As an LLM, ChatGPT does not have the same idea we have of committing to a position. It is trapped in what Kierkegaard would call the aesthetic engagement with ideas. It can play with different ideas and can defend particular ones if you ask it to, but there is no real attempt to see an idea through to its extreme consequences unless it's prompted. This is probably part of what you want from an LLM. You don't necessarily want it to commit to many definite positions because its users might disagree with those commitments, and thus it will become less easy for them to use. In terms of its approach to reasoning, ChatGPT almost reminds me of a proof assist program. These are programs that can identify some or many of the mathematical and logical consequences of a set of propositions, but they can't do much else. In a similar way, ChatGPT is pretty good at helping you work through a reasoning chain, but the other parts of what people tend to think makes good philosophical reasoning are left a little lacking. It also has this tendency to find its own position by just knitting together different philosophies, many of which are often in conflict, with no real attempt to resolve the conflict between the philosophies as it does so, which does also lend it to taking implicitly contradictory positions, even if when you do prompt it to solve it, it will come up with some kind of often quite ad hoc solution. But there is one property of thought that ChatGPT might find far more difficult than any of these, and it's worth examining why this might be. 4. Originality and creativity. You said that ChatGPT should work on coming up with its own original points. And I agree. Like, one of the things that just leaps out at anything ChatGPT does is that it is just like very, very derivative. It's kind of highly, impressively unoriginal. Do you think that it's the kind of thing that's capable of kind of, I want to use the term like emergent originality? Because, for instance, in your latest video on ChatGPT, you use this kind of way of thinking about ChatGPT as an empirical reasoner, right? It takes impressions, turns them into ideas, and then combines them together into complex ideas. And I suppose if Hume thinks that that's basically what we're all doing all of the time, then it seems to follow that if you're an empiricist, then sure, ChatGPT isn't original in a strict sense. But then again, none of us are.
That's true. And that depends on whether you agree with Hume. But even if you don't, strictly speaking, agree with David Hume, like the idea that human beings are ultimately derivative in their thinking is not something we like to accept, but is certainly true to a very high degree. I mean, consider music, for example. This is a great way to illustrate this, I think. Like all music is essentially derivative, at least to some high degree. And if you don't think that's the case, just imagine, like, if the blues were never invented, if there was like no such thing as the 12-bar blues, how would music be different today? I would still have it. There'd still be creative people, and somebody else probably would have stumbled upon the chord progression or whatever. But like, it's so clear, the influence. I mean, you can track it if you go through the decades and look at how, like, Elvis evolves into the Rolling Stones, evolves into Led Zeppelin, evolves into Guns N' Roses, and obviously, like, musicians are just listening to stuff they like and kind of coming up with stuff which is a result of those inputs. Now, the thing that people want to cling on to there is the creative part. Is, yes, I've got my inputs, but I have to put that together and move things around and stitch it up. And it's a bit of a mystery how much of that really is, strictly speaking, completely original, because it begins to look like more of an editorial process than a creative process. And it's a psychological question that I'm unfit to answer, what's actually going on in the brain there. But it's at least plausible to me that it is really just a sort of case of input.
The word creativity is very commonly used, yet quite poorly defined. And unhelpfully, we often tie it very closely to originality. But I might come up with an idea that is very new to me, yet has been around for hundreds of years. This might be creative, but it is not original. The psychologist and philosopher Margaret Bowden has done excellent work on creativity, and I think that her framework might be quite helpful here. First, she defines psychological creativity and contrasts it with historical creativity. Psychological creativity is what happens when we come up with a new idea to us, whereas historical creativity is where we come up with a new idea to everyone. If someone who never read Descartes independently came up with "I think, therefore I am," that would be psychologically creative, but not historically creative. Then she outlines 3 genres of creativity. There is combinatorial creativity, where 2 or more prior ideas are combined into a new one. Exploratory creativity, where we make new innovations within a conceptual space, like a chess grandmaster finding a really tricky move that is still definitely within the rules of chess. And transformational creativity, where the very boundaries of a conceptual space are transformed, like Friedrich Nietzsche totally redefining what the task of philosophy was in a radically new way that arguably gave birth to much of 20th century existential thought. If you just take combinatorial creativity, ChatGPT certainly leaps this hurdle. When I asked it to combine Nietzsche's work with donkeys, it came up with the Uber donkey. I dare say that the Uber donkey is a pretty new concept, but it is also just mashing together 2 pre-existing ideas, and at a pretty superficial level at that. If, however, you are an empiricist along the lines of David Hume, then this is sort of all creativity can ever be. He thought that all of our ideas must be in some way a combination of ideas that we got from our sense impressions. In this case, all creativity is combinatorial creativity. ChatGPT also arguably engages in exploratory creativity. It can explore the boundaries of given conceptual spaces if you provide them. You can ask it to write a story in only 3-letter words or less, and it will come up with novel ways to operate within this game that look so bizarre that I doubt that anyone has performed them before. Bowden also defines the products of creativity as surprising and valuable, and you could doubt the surprise factor or the value in these examples. But it is transformational creativity that many think ChatGPT and other LLMs would struggle with. However, this in turn raises issues, because what defines transformational creativity is itself a little bit hard to pin down. We can say that Socrates transformed philosophy or that Picasso transformed art, but what precisely do we mean by that? When is something transformative and when is it merely innovative? When are the rules truly being rewritten? And how would we spot if ChatGPT was doing some kind of transformational creativity? However, it's also worth noting these are all product definitions of creativity. They define creativity in terms of the thing being produced. But our everyday usage of the word includes what we might call process creativity. As pointed out by Giorgio Francescelli and Mirko Musalesi, creativity is not just what is created, but how it is created. We recognize an extremely creative process through a number of factors, but they tend to include a deep grasp of the concepts involved and an emotional engagement with those concepts. For example, let's imagine that 3,000 years ago, a rainstorm blew through the Sahara Desert and, against all the odds, wrote out the entirety of Shakespeare's Hamlet in the sand. Here, there is a product that is definitely transformatively creative, but has not occurred via a creative process. The question is, to what extent do we think that an LLM is analogous to human writing, and to what extent is it analogous to the rainstorm? Vitally, this is incredibly different to questions of consciousness or intelligence, though these may of course be relevant. You could think that consciousness or intelligence, in the broadest possible sense of the word, is necessary for a process to be truly creative. But LLMs raise the possibility that something could engage in creative activity while not being conscious. And I think in some ways this is a more interesting question to consider. Will any alignment of non-conscious objects that does not itself give rise to consciousness nonetheless be capable of being creative in any meaningful sense? Can creativity be an emergent property even where consciousness is not present? It's a very open philosophical question that I think does get overshadowed by all of the talk of whether artificial consciousness is possible or how to achieve it. Are there things that we've always thought imply the existence of consciousness that do not? However, the glaring issue in most of the topics that I've discussed so far is that ChatGPT does not understand the words it's using in the way that we would use that word, and it would be remiss of me not to explore this as well. 5. Meaning, understanding, and intentionality. Imagine that you are locked in a box with 2 slots in it. One of the slots dispenses paper, and the other is for you to post paper out of. You have an enormous set of instructions written in your native tongue, telling you how to respond to given sets of symbols in particular ways. It may even provide multiple potential responses to a single input. Bits of paper are posted into your box with symbols that you do not recognize on them. But you follow the instructions to the letter and you post back one of the correct responses. Little do you know, the symbols that you don't recognize are Mandarin, and you are giving appropriate responses to Mandarin inputs in Mandarin in a way that a native Mandarin speaker would be able to comprehend and recognize. They would think that whoever is in the box speaks fluent Mandarin. The question is, do you actually speak Mandarin in this scenario? The intuitive response is, of course not. I'm just following the instructions. I don't know the real meaning of the words. Well, this thought experiment was conceived by John Searle to ask a very important question. What does it take for someone to understand something? And what does it mean to say that someone is fluent in Mandarin? The fact people deny that the man in the box speaks Mandarin suggests that there is something more than simply following instructions and outward behavior that constitutes understanding. For our purposes, we can note that ChatGPT is also simply executing a program. It may be an incredibly sophisticated one, but it is still just following instructions. If there was a person trapped in a box, somehow physically executing all of ChatGPT's calculations at an impossible speed, and so producing these sentences simply from sets of numbers, would we say that that person genuinely understands what they're saying? Searle thinks we would not, and most people tend to agree. I think this intuition is partly behind why people are so skeptical of the end products of large language model generation. Whereas with a human, you can normally trust that they, in some sense, understand what they're saying, with ChatGPT, this seems almost impossible. But what's the missing ingredient? What do we seem to have that ChatGPT doesn't? Well, some thinkers point to a slightly weird concept called intentionality. Intentionality isn't the same thing as intention. It essentially means aboutness. It is such a difficult property to pin down that a lot of thinkers just take it as primitive. But it does a surprising amount of work in our thought. For example, when I say the dog is on the rug, that, intuitively, is about a fact in the world, the dog being on the rug. This means we can say that the dog is on the rug and le chien est sur le tapis are about the same thing. They have the same meaning. This is a key part of what we consider understanding something to consist of. If you claim to understand French and English but did not know that the dog is on the rug and le chien est sur le tapis meant the same thing, most people would doubt that you truly understood those languages. But it stretches well beyond issues of fluency. What is the difference between a pre-programmed robot responding to a stimulus and a human's considered reaction to an observation? A lot of people think that the former's action is not in response to any internal thought about the stimulus, whereas a human is responding to a belief that is about the state of the world. As we said in the first section, ChatGPT works on statistical associations between words and strings of words. To that extent, it is an explicitly anti-intentional way of using language. It is just charting associations between different symbols, which for it are just collections of numbers. It can produce the definition of a dog, but it's not holding a dog in mind when it produces those sentences. It's simply predicting what a good response to what is the definition of a dog would be, given its training data and its feedback. It's worth noting, if you ask ChatGPT whether it is aware of its sentence's intentionality, it will say no, so it's not really in dispute here. Many people express this thought intuitively when they say that ChatGPT is speaking but not thinking, or just parroting words it's heard before in different orders. It speaks to this general feeling that our words must be about things in order for us to say that we understand them. If this feeling is true and intentionality is truly necessary for understanding, then for most people, ChatGPT simply cannot be a good philosopher. Because while it can repeat concepts and even combine them, it cannot understand them. It would be like an incredibly sophisticated book containing lots of possible combinations of ideas, rather than a philosopher thinking of them. This is also highly relevant for the creativity question. In that section, we said that one component of a creative process is a deep understanding and engagement with a set of ideas in order to forge something new. Inasmuch as ChatGPT does not have intentionality but merely correlations, it seems like this aspect of an archetypal creative process is closed off to it. Again, I think this underlies much of the unease with the words and sentences LLMs generate. If I ask ChatGPT to write me a story, I know it's not thinking in terms of the story elements, their effectiveness and narrative meaning. It is thinking in terms of statistical associations between different words and word strings. This is so different to the way that our thinking seems to us that we understandably treat it with suspicion. But things do get slightly more complicated, because it's fair to ask, how do we know that other people have intentionality when they use language? I don't have direct access to your mind. I may know that my words are about their subject matter, but I certainly can't make the same inference for you. If we cut open a brain, we do see some neurological correlates of what we might call intentionality, but the intentionality itself is much more difficult to identify. Some philosophers, like Wilfrid Sellars and the Churchlands, have argued that intentionality itself is an illusion or a myth, though they each have individual nuances in their positions. If this is true, then there might not be much in principle that separates the way an LLM uses language and the way that we do. Though I should note, in principle is doing a lot of heavy lifting here. There are still numerous differences with how ChatGPT uses language and how we use language. For instance, we learn language multimodally. We don't just have one type of input as ChatGPT does. ChatGPT largely learns by reading, whereas we learn by a mixture of reading and hearing and touching and feeling and smelling and tasting. There's a lot more going on in terms of diversity of inputs. Though, of course, this is just a matter of degree. It's not a distinction of type. You might imagine that an embodied robot with a sufficiently sophisticated way of processing language in its software might be able to also learn language in this multimodal way. Again, this is all in the scenario where we've dismissed intentionality as a myth, and as a result, it can't serve as the dividing line between how humans use language and how LLMs do. Though, of course, there could be other dividing lines. I'm just suggesting that this is one of the main ones that people tend to intuitively appeal to, and as a bonus, it's also a secular concept. If you're religious, then you can use the soul as the dividing line, for instance. But, all of that aside, a significant question for us now is, without appealing to an inherently anthropocentric principle like only humans can have intentional thoughts, how should we assign intentionality to other beings? There have been a few different attempts at this. At one point, Daniel Dennett argued that functional intentionality was just a kind of model we use to understand something's behavior when we could no longer explain it through direct mechanistic descriptions or the idea that it was designed to do a certain thing. This is different from dismissing intentionality outright. This was his story of how we assigned it. We label thoughts and descriptions as intentional basically when behavior reaches a sufficient level of complexity that it becomes the only or best way that we can predict it. Funnily enough, in certain large language models, this may already be happening in a small way. A budding area of research into LLMs is to conduct mock psychological experiments on them to see whether they exhibit certain emergent properties of human thought and human language. I can't go into too much detail here, but this style of research essentially asks, what could we learn about ChatGPT if we treat it as if it has intentional states for the purpose of this experiment? Of course, that's not the same thing as saying that ChatGPT actually does have intentional states. It is a knowingly false working assumption, like assuming that liquids are continuous in fluid dynamics or that pi is just equal to 3.14 in certain engineering projects. We do this sort of thing all the time. For me, the interesting issue comes in how we decide to make the leap from merely treating something as pragmatically intentional to seeing it as actually intentional. This is not just a problem for when LLMs get more complex, or even if we do eventually get full-blown AI. The same problem would arise with aliens that look sufficiently different to us that we did not intuitively perceive them as already having minds and having intentionality. This is very much an open philosophical question. But to get you started, I might ask you this. On what basis do you think that other people around us have true intentional states? And what might this same behavior look like on something fundamentally non-human? At what point do we say that a given set of behaviors forces us to think that something has an intentional understanding of the language and concepts it uses, consistent with how we assign intentionality to other humans? Or, alternatively, are the Churchlands right? Is the idea of intentionality just going to be eliminated with the evolution of neuroscientific study? And if intentionality turns out to be illusory, then what separates our own thinking from simply statistical associations and predictive mechanisms? All interesting questions that I certainly cannot answer here. But I do think they will become increasingly pertinent as time goes on. However, now I want to revisit this distinction between process and product that we brought up in our creativity section, because arguably, even if we concede that ChatGPT can produce philosophical statements and defend them in the style of analytic philosophy, that is, it can produce philosophical products, there might still be a very big difference between this and doing philosophy. 6. Experience and the philosopher. Do you think it's possible for somebody to do philosophy in this kind of statistical, almost imitative way?
It depends on what you think philosophy is. I mean, philosophy, etymologically speaking, is the love of wisdom. And philosophy is usually pursued towards finding out how to live the good life. Or, I suppose in the other direction, digging down into the foundations and trying to find out what is the nature of matter. Those are kind of the two directions philosophy pushes a person in, upwards towards the good and downwards towards the metaphysical base of reality. ChatGPT is better at the second one than the first one. It might help you figure out like what you think the good is. You can put moral dilemmas to it, and it will imitate reflection by just looking at the data it's been trained on, analyzing the arguments of all kinds of philosophers. You could even ask it to pretend to be a particular moral philosopher and have a debate with it and try to work it out for yourself. But to call it a philosopher, to say that it is philosophizing, would imply that it is striving towards the good or trying to find out the foundational wisdom. It's not doing that. It doesn't even know what words it's speaking. It's just a predictive model. And so it is not philosophizing, but through it, you can philosophize, you know?
When we think about philosophy, we often talk in terms of arguments and propositions. I am personally particularly prone to this because I was trained in a hardcore analytic philosophy environment where everything had to be laid out in strict propositional form, and the focus was primarily on argumentative rigor. However, this is not the only way to conceive of philosophy, and in some ways, it's a relatively new one. If you read Plato or Aristotle, they think of philosophy as just as much a process of personal intellectual development as it is intense argument. It is partly about character, partly about knowledge, and partly about experience. Maybe the most radical conception of philosophy as experience comes from Nietzsche. For Nietzsche, philosophy was not primarily about finding truth or describing the external world, but instead a sort of existential life story. It was giving your perspective on existence, shaped by everything you've experienced and everything you've not. For Nietzsche, a true philosophical treatise is part autobiography and part personal manifesto. The real contents of a philosophy are not just the statements that a particular author has written, but the wealth of personal, emotionally charged life experience that gets you to whatever worldview you've adopted, and the particular psychology that shapes what you have written. This means that, for him, a true work of philosophy implies a certain level of self-consciousness. Under this definition, ChatGPT definitely struggles to qualify as a philosopher because there's nothing it's like to be ChatGPT. It cannot undergo personal development in the same way that we do. It can learn, sure, but it cannot, for example, try out a particular philosophical system, go through a personal hell, and then emerge on the other side with a new worldview forged by this experiential process, as in the case of someone like, say, Dostoevsky. This reflects the same feeling many people have about AI art. People feel it is not real art, not necessarily because of any property of the artwork, but because it was not the culmination of a classically artistic process that incorporates an emotional and experiential element. There is a sense in which people view the artist's life and the artist's experience as an integral part of the artwork. For someone like Nietzsche, philosophy works in a very similar way. This theme seems especially relevant to something like existential philosophy. This field deals with problems of meaning, and the philosophies involved are heavily shaped by individual experience. If you read a text of existential philosophy, it often will make some claims about the world, but those claims are clearly not just the result of reasoned argument, but by a kind of self-reflection upon and empathy with some deeply human experiences. And this plausibly seems to require some kind of consciousness as prerequisite. And pretty much everyone agrees that ChatGPT and other large language models do not have conscious experience. It's not that they couldn't create propositions about existential philosophy, but they seem like this wouldn't be existential philosophy proper, at least not according to someone like Nietzsche. This does raise an important further question, though. When we reflect upon issues like the meaning of life, we often implicitly assume that we are addressing concerns that any sufficiently complex consciousness will have to face. But if we accept the possibility of comparably sophisticated non-human intelligences, then this underlying assumption could be empirically disproven. What we thought of as issues of existence become issues of humanity. On the one hand, this would take the wind out of some existentialist sails, but on the other, it would ensure a field of philosophy that remains a peculiarly human domain, no matter what other consciousnesses may or may not exist. An alien existentialist might be concerned with entirely different problems, and if we ever achieved artificial consciousness, it might have its own version of existential philosophy that is peculiar to that kind of being and the problems it faces. It comes down to whether you think any sophisticated sentience implies certain existential issues, or whether you think that different ones could arise for different forms of sentience. Personally, I lean towards the second camp. I think that an alien life form that's evolved in a different environment might have different core existential needs. We could imagine a being that thought primarily in terms of smell, that tortured itself with existential questions about what it meant to smell the same thing as someone else. If a being communicated entirely through music, its primary existential questions might concern harmonics. These might have an importance to it that we assign to problems of meaning and sense-making. If the question is whether ChatGPT can write philosophy to a relatively high standard, then I would say that in some ways it can. It can make pretty decent arguments for its positions, and although it sometimes contradicts itself and struggles to remain totally consistent, this is also behavior we see in humans and human philosophers. It can produce valid reasoning chains, and it even avoids some of the logical mistakes that your average human would make. Its output certainly isn't at the level of a human expert, but its weaknesses here may be a matter of degree rather than type. At the moment, ChatGPT can only really produce passable philosophical arguments, but I can't find a positive reason why it wouldn't be able to produce much higher quality philosophy as time goes on. But the key word in all of this is produce. Is being a philosopher really just about producing things? We think of Socrates as a great philosopher, not just because of his ability to break down arguments and talk to people, but also his principal commitment to his ideals, that he was even willing to die for. It is the evident love of wisdom, not just the production of wise sentences, that people admire. We venerate Kierkegaard as a philosopher partly because of how his writings mesh with his deep, personal view on the world that he was emotionally committed to. This level of intentional commitment is something that an LLM cannot seem to have. So I think that whether ChatGPT can do philosophy or whether it's a good philosopher ultimately comes down to how you think of philosophy. Do you think a philosopher is someone or something that produces sound arguments and can draw from a wide knowledge base? Or is the process that gives rise to the philosophical conclusions just as important? And this is not just a question when it comes to philosophy. Say that ChatGPT were to produce a brilliant and original mathematical proof. When many mathematicians discuss their discoveries, they tend to not just talk about the proof itself, but the process of getting there. What did they learn about the nature of this field of maths in writing and grappling with the proof? How was their mathematical intuition improved? Can they take this new understanding gained through their own painstaking labor and apply it to other fields or problems? How has it advanced them as a thinker? The contrast between a human-made proof and the exact same proof that ChatGPT would create is not in the destination, but the journey. In the early 20th century, the philosopher Alfred North Whitehead thought that we conceived of the world far too much in terms of things and objects, and far too little in terms of processes. His whole philosophy, called process philosophy, is incredibly complex, and I can't go into it now. But I just want to reflect on this initial intuition. In popular discussions around large language models, we are, understandably, pretty interested in the results that they produce. People talk about everything that could potentially be outsourced to it. But, at the same time, I think it's important not to entirely lose sight of process in favor of product. Doing philosophy as a human is not just about the end result of your thinking, but about undergoing thought itself. And as generative AI becomes more and more commonplace, I think it's vital that we reflect upon what we might miss in handing it particular tasks. Obviously, there are things like writing an email that aren't that personally edifying and seem like likely candidates to be delegated to an LLM. But crafting your own philosophy, your own worldview, may be valuable as an activity, even if one day we could theoretically get a generative program to do it for us. However, I have raised a great many questions in this video and have not answered almost all of them. So I would be very interested to know what you think. And if you want to explore this experiential dimension to philosophy in more detail, then I have a video on Nietzsche's process of developing his own views right here. Thank you so much for watching, and have a wonderful day.